Hello, everybody. My name is Roberta Buiani, and I am the artistic director of the ISEA Salon, which is an organization hosted by the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. The goal of the ISEA Salon is to foster interdisciplinary dialogues between the arts and the sciences on topics of interest to both sides. The goal is not just to do science outreach, but to confront each other's methods and approaches and come out with new ideas to describe complex phenomena, to see things from a different angle, and to link scientific method, politics, and care. I feel I needed to clarify this just to give you a context, because the project Boundary Crossings and the people in the panel that will follow started at, have an approach that is very much related to this type of mandate. So in the fall 2019, Joel Ong, Jennifer Willett, and I had a chat about boundaries. What does boundaries mean? Boundaries are used to separate the disciplines. They are used to distinguish between the human and the non-human, such as the body and the technologies, the body and the bacteria, the self and the other. It is used to discriminate between real and artificial, and to indicate physical and artificial boundaries or borders, so to constrain geographically nation states. So what does crossing boundaries mean? Does it mean thinking beyond disciplinary conventions, working across institutions and across countries, seeing institutional places differently, such as, for example, seeing university atriums, libraries, and working areas as theater and performance places? Or does it mean to become aware of the impossibility of erecting borders in a world where we actually share the air that we breathe? Is it to conceive of biotechnology as a technology of love and compassion, or to understand labor as an activity that is not just exclusively human, but it is a co-production of bacteria, technologies, and data? So besides the single contributions, I believe that it is a particularly good time to discuss this concept. So we had conceived of this project as a very physical itinerant series, literally crossing the boundaries of different spaces, the gallery, the theater, the lab, the lecture hall, but also the boundaries of institutions. So we had planned to do stuff in academia and stuff in public places. The series would consist of 2 artist residencies, and Stephanie Rottenberg was one of the residents, and we had invited other artists. It would consist of traditional panels and roundtables, but also participatory performances, art installations, and demonstrations over the course of the month of May. Unfortunately, we had planned to make ISEA as our last stop. So right now we are basically going backward because the event never happened. So ironically, to change our plans came the quintessential border crosser, which is the coronavirus. So SARS-CoV-2 pervaded our spaces, our bodies and activities, completely oblivious to the boundaries that we had established in order to make things work for us. And its presence here is forcing us to find other ways So it's making us think hard. As we're still learning how to coexist with this uninvited guest, we're also forced to reflect on the significance of boundaries today and how we can communicate our original concept right now. For example, it is very interesting, or at least I find it personally very interesting, that now we are compelled to perform online trapped in boxes. And yet we have acquired an unprecedented freedom of virtual movement, thanks to the abilities to communicate via ether with other people across the world without the need to travel. So let's use the few minutes that we have each to ask one important question. What is the significance of boundaries and the value of boundary crossing today? And let's remind ourselves that this is a time when all the fashioned ideas of boundaries appear to have been transcended in favor of more fluid conceptions. But on the other hand, geopolitical and institutional powers seem to have been reinforced, and new boundaries and borders seem to have been built. Part of it because of the geopolitical dynamics, but part of it also because of the coronavirus. So I am looking forward to the reflections that will come afterward. Hi, here I am again. I want to provide a little bit more context for the concept explored with this project. So Anat Singh argues that we need new narratives to reveal the coexistence of plants, animals, and microorganisms, amongst other things, to provide evidence of the need to rethink older notions of boundaries, and to show how the distinction and the barriers that science, technology, society, and the state have created are in fact blurred and porous. In welcoming Singh's challenge, the project Boundary Crossings sought to expand her call to include the disciplines whose focus lies not only on the natural sciences and biology, but also on digital technologies. Our concern spans beyond examining the boundaries and the symbiosis between disciplines, or between the biological and informational. In fact, this particular approach allows us and the artists involved to address much more problematic and very much debated kind of discourses pertaining to the loose topics of boundaries and borders. So for example, just as organisms and bodies are permeable, multiple, and home to myriads of other organisms, so state demarcations too are like bodies, entertaining multiple relations, drawing benefits from visitors and collaborators, acquiring some qualities from outsiders and from newcomers. Stephanie Fisher explains how state politics, understood on the basis of an inside-outside dichotomy, are systems that have been deprived of their diversity and are now declining and becoming vulnerable. However, as it is currently defined, state politics still fits a sort of pure culture paradigm in biology when it discriminates between the bodies who belong and those who don't, when it excludes the physicality, when it excludes the physically and culturally different, when it establishes flying bans against certain countries, or when it builds walls and other physical barriers. We are concerned with the way notions of borders and boundaries are used to demarcate and to separate individuals, spaces, and territories. This is why we came out with the idea of boundary crossings, to go past divisions in institutional subject areas, to go past the reliance on the limited disciplines and discipline-specific method, but also to go past a general belief in the concept of disciplinary, organic, and material purity. So all of these concepts are very helpful because they help us identify and name things. But on the other hand, they clash against the complementarity of real life and virtual reality, or the combined work of the human, the non-human, and the technological, and they seem to misread the symbiotic relationship between the body and its surrounding environment, the constant crossing of borders by animal, bacteria, and seeds. And I think that we have plenty of examples in what has been going on in the past few months. So I'm not going to repeat myself. So in order to expose how compartmentalized structures still dominate our lives, we have envisioned a project that literally explodes the constrained spaces we are supposed to perform in. For example, we plan to turn a study space, the Loft, into a spa where Belgium-based artist Isabel Burrati would offer participants to try beauty products whose ingredients were harvested from the human body of volunteers. We envisioned a picnic and a walk along the Canada and the US border. We planned to have participants touring between Toronto and Windsor, and maybe even the United States. All of this was to think beyond the boundaries of conventional spaces and the expectation of academic institutional formats and usage of space. We basically planned to demonstrate in practice what we had theorized during this month. So now that our borderless friend has temporarily changed, or maybe for good, the way we interact with each other, what kind of strategies are at our disposal to make our point clear? One idea would be to turn to older technologies such as snail mail or physically distanced performances or bike tours or hybrid events that focus on the local that disseminate globally, and so on and so forth. These are all possibilities, but they need to be thought throughout. And I think this is the right place to do this. And I would like to workshop these ideas with you, and maybe we can come up with something together. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Joel Ong, and my paper today is entitled Borderless, a Commonwealth of Air in Contemporary Art and Technoscience. To preface this talk, I want to say that we are probably more aware of our atmosphere and this idea of the Commonwealth or sharing of air than ever before. Not least in part due to the pandemic, which has kind of forced us into these insular bubbles. But also due to the murder of George Floyd, which has simultaneously armed and disarmed us in the way that it's forced us inside, to be more introspective and self-reflexive of our actions, but also in the way that it's mobilized us to take to the streets in protest. And I think that these actions are really important in and caused profound shifts in our political atmospheres today in the way that these voices not only reach our ears, but have also reached, the lungs and the very humanity, physical humanity of an entire generation. Now, my interest in boundary crossings kind of extends from, my interest in acoustic resonances of both environments as well as built spaces. And these domestic spaces are very familiar to us all now, I'd imagine. And so I was really interested, I am really interested in the ways that we transverse this, or we cross these boundaries between the inside and the outside, and the way that we move perhaps through one space of resonance to the next. Now, of course, leaving these spaces, going outside, at least for the most part of this year, has really been something that has been an absurd suggestion. And Gaston Bachelard kind of talks about freedom as a kind of absurdity. In his book, The Poetics of Space, he discusses, he narrates a story of a prisoner who's kind of stuck in jail, and he looks out, through a small little window, and then he draws a tunnel on his wall, and to the mocking of his jailers, he actually gets in an imaginary train and rides off. So, in the current meteorological turn, a lot of artists and cultural theorists are kind of looking to the air as a kind of absurd freedom. Perhaps in opposition or in reaction to the gravitas of what could be considered the terrestrial, human, or urban conditions. One example is the exhibition Floating Utopias, which was staged at the Art Science Museum a couple of years ago, where artists like Thomas Saraceno and Graham Stevens kind of proposed these really interesting inflatable structures that would be suspended in the middle of the air in reaction, obviously, to the congestion of the urban space down below. Let's see if I can get a little better lighting on this, from this angle. Of course, artists like seminal artists like Scott Hassel's work Celestial Mechanics shows us that the air is not entirely free. You can't just live up there indefinitely, but he shows through his work Celestial Mechanics the kind of boarded zones that the atmosphere takes, and the way that each zone is actually militarized and instrumentalized to a very, very large extent. Another project that's really interesting is the space scientist Regina Lee from York University, who thinks about the cultural and technological ripples of satellite explosions in space. And so she looks at, amongst other things, the 2009 crash of Russian satellites and the way the debris is still causing lots of damage, not only in the air, in the atmospheres, but also down in terms of communication breakdowns, etc. But of course, we look up to the skies as a kind of ideal, not only because of the metaphors that the atmosphere gives us, it being free and open and large and invisible to a large extent, perhaps, but also because of this very notion of ascension, as opposed to a descent, where ascension has been taught to us through mythology or religion as a kind of reach for the celestial, and the descent is kind of like the opposite of that, and termed as a kind of fall or failure. Now, Gaston Bachelard again identifies this as a kind of vertical differential, and he talks about it in his book Air and Dreams. This is part of his elemental imagination series. The third book in there talks about air. But he, instead of thinking about this as a kind of polemic, up or down, he wants to think about the fall as a kind of inverted ascent. And in so doing, we can kind of think about the ascent not just as a kind of reaching for, some kind of a transcendental goal, but instead, it's something that incorporates an array of metaphors, both of vertigo and of victory. Now, I have another paper that I'm speaking that I give at ISEA entitled "Queering the Atmosphere," where I think about vertigo as a very important sensorial framework to think about climate geoengineering. So these are experiments right now that are intervening on the atmosphere. with obvious planetary consequences, but these are being decided by a very, very small group of people, very small group of well-funded people. And so it's really important for us, to look at these discourses, which are largely gendered as well, from a kind of sensorial or sensory ethnography viewpoint, so that we do not silence the voices of people with whom these actions would actually impact largely. On the notion of strangeness, I think, and discomfort, the pandemic has also kind of reduced our ability to host in Toronto at Sensorium a couple of artistic residencies that we were really excited to have start. One of which was the artist who's also on this panel, Stephanie Rothenberg, and she was going to present her work Proof of Soil, and also Sensorium would have been part of her journey towards realizing her work that is currently on show at ISEA as well. The other artist would have been performance artist Jaco Borgreave, who is an amazing performance artist who works with all manners of bodily signals, electrical and otherwise, I think. And he was to come over here and kind of work with scientists and biophysicists to kind of think about new performance methodologies. And of course, this was also to culminate in the presentation at ISEA, which obviously right now is not happening. I want to say that these experiments and these residencies were for us a chance to experiment with the ideas of a technocultural ambience sharing, across different institutions. So with Stephanie's project, it would have seen some work done at Coalesce in the University of Buffalo. We would see some work done with us as well. And a number of different makerspaces that she had worked with in California. And so these give us the opportunity right now to kind of think about the telematics or these kind of sharing of information and experiences over a remote or virtual platform such as this now, which is kind of weird for me because this is also a bit of a time leap. We're going to be looking at this. I recorded this about 2 months in advance, I think. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of think of these as ways of sharing ambiences, as ways of sharing atmospheres, and think about them as a way of sharing affect as well. And so, I look forward to the Q&A when I think we'll be discussing more about these boundary crossing activities across the real and the virtual, and remote and private. And I also would really love to hear from Stephanie herself as well in a couple of minutes. So thank you all for your time, and thanks for taking this walk with me, and I will see you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Willett. I'm an associate professor at the University of Windsor in Canada, and I'm here with my colleagues from a few different other institutions to talk about boundary crossing within art and science and biotechnology. Let me share my screen. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Windsor. I run a lab there called Incubator Art Lab, and I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Art, Science, and Ecology. The University of Windsor is at a very interesting geographic location right on the border of Canada and the US. And it's a traditional sort of traveling space. So there's all different types of tensions working in this environment. And I try to run a lab that is culturally and geographically located and engages with the histories and tensions of that space. Windsor is also a former it's an auto manufacturing town. And so a lot of my students have very makerly skills and come from families that have worked in the auto field. Our department is hosted in an old armory building in downtown Windsor that was renovated and opened in 2018. Within that space, Incubator Art Lab has a facility. It's a bioart lab that is in the main atrium of the Armory building. And this lab is a BSL level 2 bioart laboratory. So we do biotechnological protocols, but towards the production of art rather than the production of science. And the lab is also a transparent space. It's intended as an environment where people can sort of casually pass by and see us working on our projects, but also it becomes a theatrical performance space. So we can do live bioart performances in there. It's beautiful, very interested in aesthetics that transcend traditional bioart laboratory or biotech laboratory aesthetics. So a lot of sort of domestic inferences in the space as well. And then, like I said, we just received CFI funding to turn it into a multimedia laboratory. So there will be theatrical lighting and sound and multimedia components, as well as an upgrade in some of our scientific equipment. So eventually we'll be able to do projects like bioart opera. I run a research group called Incubator Art Lab. We have artists and scientists and students from all over the world come join us and work on their projects as well as my own. And then I also teach the bioart class. This is bioart, contemporary art in the life sciences. It's an undergraduate class where students from all across the university come and engage in science and technology tools, but towards, again, cultural or artistic production. And the lab that I run is sort of different, and the sort of big boundary crossing idea I want to impose upon all of you today is the idea that biotechnology can be a technology of love. And that sort of rationality and objectivity also can function hand in hand with compassion, love, empathy, acknowledgement of suffering and pain. So our lab is focused on reimagining biotech futures through bioart practices that are located in feminist and post-colonial perspectives that involve advanced digital and biotechnologies, historical, agricultural, and indigenous knowledges, community engagement, sustainability, love, joy, gratitude, and the acknowledgement of suffering. Today, I just want to tell you a little bit about a project that we've recently completed called Baroque Biology. It's a much larger series of work, but today we're just going to talk about some of the lab work that we did around this project called Baroque Biology Paper Theater. And these are a series of 20 photographs of GMO bacteria growing in imaginary biological vignettes where non-human organisms teach humans complex biotechnological protocols. Sometimes the human characters are open to receiving the communicated information, and sometimes they are hostile or ignorant to the messages they are receiving across species. So these works are collaborative. I have a large team of students and staff who work with me on my projects. A lot of them are scientists and artists, and they all bring different skill bases to the project. And a project like this would not be possible without that larger effort. We work with technologies that are quite often already existing, but we are interested in innovating new and novel uses of those technologies. So for this project, we created a library of rainbow GMO bacteria that we purchased through Amino Labs, and they have an at-home laboratory kit that you can use to do this work yourself. And then we spent a couple of years working out all the different techniques on 3D agar and how to color the agar appropriately, whether or not you could use gold leaf on agar, how to do temporary tattoos on agar. And then we started doing these sort of plates where we would make these little vignettes, these little theater shows where the bacteria could engage with other artistic components to create these collaborative narrative stories for audiences. And so these are some of the final works. And what we did is we would grow these beautiful dishes and then lay them out in the lab, layered on top of collage. And the collage is paper theater backgrounds that we had ordered from a traditional paper theater supplier. Paper theater is a tradition in the fine arts. And so these are scenography from that tradition. And then we had a photographer come in and do top-down photography of these arrangements for final digital prints. They all got these sort of enigmatic names. This one's called Clandestine Cavernous Communication. And they all are about these sort of like, these interactions in interspecies, laboratory environments, but maybe where the humans are not the primary or top end organism always in that interaction. The last thing I just want to talk about a little bit today in terms of boundary crossing is like facility design. So the lab in one case, but also now we're about to open the Incubator Art Lab studio. And this studio is a downtown storefront studio in Windsor that will be an art studio. So we'll be able to build large sculptural objects and that type of thing there. But it will also be a community engagement lab. And so it'll be a BSL level 1 laboratory in the front end of this studio where we can host community groups, students, grade school children to come in and learn more about bioart. That's my presentation for today. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Rothenberg. I'm an artist based in Buffalo, New York. I work in the Department of Art at the University of Buffalo, and the title of my talk is Who's the Boss? Microbes for Hire. Who's the Boss? Microbes for Hire. This talk is a broader version of what is in the abstract, and I'm going to be focusing on a few key moments in the historic and contemporary entanglements between science and economics, and how new imaging technologies have enabled artists to think about these entanglements in new ways, from the micro to the macro, that don't privilege humans over non-humans. The entanglement of the natural sciences and economics has a long history, beginning with the relationship between Darwin and Malthus. It is said that Malthus's ideas around human population and the struggle in society influenced Darwin's ideas around the theory of evolution and natural selection. If we jump 100 years later to the 1990s, we see this played out again in what is known as biological market theory, BMT. In the early 1990s, a concept of a biological market started to become popularized by evolutionary biologists. Most notable was the research of Ronald Noe and Peter Hammerstein. BMT was a methodology for understanding the evolution and dynamics of cooperation and reciprocity in organisms through analogies of economic markets. 4 basic conditions needed to exist in order for a so-called biological market to emerge. First, there had to be exchange and trade of commodities. Second, you had to have discriminative partner choice from a number of potential partners. Third, you had to have outbidding competition in order to increase commodity value. And fourth, you had to have some variation of supply and demand. The poster child example for BMT is the cleaner fish. With the cleaner fish, you have a simple exchange of commodities between the cleaner fish and the client fish. I like to use the analogy of a car wash. Cleaners are territorial and usually occupy fixed territories of a few feet on, let's say, a coral reef. The clients line up in queue at these cleaning stations to get their skin cleansed of ectoparasites. These ectoparasites are a major part of the cleaner's diet. Now you might be thinking, what about the lack of cognition and rational thinking within these interactions? This was the prime reason Adam Smith rejected the idea of non-human markets. But I think most people are aware that many transactions occur due to irrational human thinking and behavior. Contemporary Dutch microbiologist Toby Keers, who follows in the footsteps of the earlier biological market theorists, incorporates this issue into her research. Keers states, when speaking about roots and fungi, that unlike in human economies that rely on cognition to make decisions, traders in this underground market bargain, borrow, and cheat, all in the absence of thought. Our aim is to understand how organisms without brains evolve different trading strategies. She goes on to talk about how these microorganisms use sensing to make complex calculations about the larger macro network. In this image, you see her current research using quantum dot technology and how it can be used to track trading strategies of mycorrhizal fungi. Using color tagging, it shows how organisms move resources from rich to poor patches and alter their trading strategies to capitalize on high demand. Returning to the theme of the panel, multiscalar boundary crossings, I want to underscore a shift I see from these previous examples in scientific research, where you see an anthropomorphizing to a new perception that views these bioeconomic entanglements as integral to the functioning of these human economic systems. I used Donna Haraway's concept of sympoiesis to articulate this new perception of entanglement between the biological and the economic. Haraway defines sympoiesis as a making with and a becoming with, in which all players render each other capable as, quote, civic subjects and objects in interaction. In other words, a more equal level playing field, if you will. I'll briefly now discuss 3 artworks, and there are many, many more, and hopefully we can talk about them in the discussion, that point to this shift in thinking about the role of the non-human on a micro level in the larger scope of economic systems. In Paul Vanus's recent work, Labor, which won the 2019 Ars Electronica Golden Nika Award, the critical role of the microbial world in performing work is visualized. The installation is a dynamic, self-regulating system that recreates the scent of people exerting themselves under stressful conditions. The smells are created by bacteria propagating in the 3 glass bioreactors, each bioreactor incubating a unique species of human skin bacteria responsible for the primary scent of sweating bodies. The white t-shirts exhibited, an icon of sweatshop labor, materialize the microbes through sweat stains, revealing the wearer's exertion and physical activity. In underscoring this shift from the anthropomorphizing of the non-human in economic models to a more equivalent role, I quote Vanus. The Labor Project reflects upon industrial society's shift from human and machine labor to increasingly pervasive forms of microbial manufacturing. Today, microbes produce a wide range of products, including enzymes, food, fuels, pharmaceuticals. They literally live to work. Vanus goes on to talk about the exploitation of life and living processes incurred by these new industrial activities. I move on to another project, one of my own, titled Proof of Soil, that speculates on the use of in-ground microbial fuel cells to supply the massive amount of energy needed to power the blockchain. Studies have assessed that the amount of energy needed to power the digital currency Bitcoin is equivalent to the energy use in the US state of Rhode Island or the country of Switzerland. In microbial fuel cells, bacteria in the soil create an electric charge that can be captured when the microbes metabolize elements in the soil. Many bioremediation projects utilize this ability as the microbes can metabolize toxic metals in the soil. Based on the microbes' ability to bioremediate the soil, the project looks at the unused land of brownfields, toxic brownfields on former factory sites. It asks, what if this land could be used by the microbes to provide the power for blockchain mining centers? The diagram here looks at the greater Chicago, Illinois area. It speculates on the amount of energy that could be produced by microbes on existing brownfields in order to process all of Chicago's blockchain mining centers, as Chicago is the 3rd largest data center in the US. So you can see the brown dots are the brownfields and the red dots are the data centers. The installation consists of the diagram and a model of a brownfield, which you see here, and 2 video screens. One showing a simulation of the geobacteria microbe in the soil performing their labor. And a second screen shows real-time data visualization of the blockchain, the artificial intelligence doing its labor. And lastly, Helen Pritchard's Critter Compiler from 2016. In brief, the artwork looks at the necropolitics of biosensor manufacturing and how the functioning of biosensor computer chips is dependent on the death and dying of living organisms. And as I mentioned, hopefully we can unpack these projects further in the panel discussion. In conclusion, I want to say there are many other artworks that visualize how the non-human world is directly implicated in contemporary capitalist economics. Just like the horse-drawn plows of the early 1800s, these microbial workers are part and parcel and integral to the functioning of these human economic systems.
So we're live.
Oh, we are live. Oh, okay. Hi. So we don't have a moderator, so we will self-moderate. So, throughout all the presentations, so there are a bunch of things that I wanted to say about this panel. So this panel was supposed to be as like a response to an event that we were plotting, but of course the event never happened. But still, first of all, we were able to reflect anyway about the topics of boundary crossing and border crossing, and second, at least in like in a small degree, some of us will actually create something in the next few weeks. Of course, it's gonna happen online, but yeah, like, I mean, we cannot do anything else otherwise. So, throughout the panel, I kept going back to the question of what boundaries are we crossing? And I think each of us should say something about their own project because we are crossing boundaries in so many different ways, and we are conceptualizing things in so many different ways. I'm very fascinated by Jennifer's concept of like the technology of love and how this entails. And I'm also very fascinated by Stephanie's constant back and forth between the biological and the informational, and how she can make sense of both of them, and how Joel is so into this idea of the atmosphere, and how we are sharing the atmosphere all together. So like we are in this condition of symbiosis, really, that we should keep in mind, since being in the same atmosphere means not being able to actually put boundaries between each other. So who wants to go first? Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Roberta. So I'm just really pleased to be here with all of you, my colleagues. This idea started with the idea of maybe like a road trip, right? Because all of our universities are within driving distance together. And there was this idea that we would sort of cohort our way up and down the highway and interact with one another and each other's labs and learn more about the different strategies that we're each deploying in our own environments. So I'm really happy to talk a little bit about biotechnology as a technology of love. It actually came of this idea after the BioArt Camp project in 2011, where I'd taken a bunch of artists and scientists camping in the forest. And we spent a great deal of time caring for one another, but also caring for the organisms we were growing in our lab that we built in the forest. And I remember after everyone left, I was really tired, and I'm crying to my assistant, and I said, I think biotechnology might be a technology of love. And I made a small little piece about it soon afterwards. And this has become sort of the mantra for the lab and for my own practice. And it acknowledges the love and the sort of that it's not a romance novel kind of love. It's the type of love that we afford, you know, in the real world, but also acknowledges pain and suffering and death, and that not all relationships are equal. So it's sort of like a sticky, uncomfortable kind of love at times. And I try to deploy that in my work in terms of the content and the way that I try to deploy it in the lab, also in terms of how I engage with my students, how we engage with the other organisms in the lab. And I try to deploy it in the sort of administrative structure. That's really thinking a lot right now about how we can perform biotechnology as a technology of love in a larger institutional environment. Back to the group.
Yeah. I'm wondering what is, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can go next.
Joel, yeah.
So thank you, Jennifer. Really amazing. I mean, I'm thinking for my part, I think we started off being really interested, even before COVID struck and everybody had to be remotely connected, we were starting to think about the ways that we could visualize or activate the invisible networks between these geographical spaces that we're talking about. Because, if we think about, this road trip that was kind of planned, you automatically kind of envision like Toronto in one sphere and then Windsor in one sphere and maybe Buffalo in another, and like these lines that would intersect and maybe go back and forth between them, depending on research activity or actual human movement. And so one of the things that we were already interested in bringing together was this like a sharing of ambiences that, it's interesting, now I guess you're hearing my voice mediated through the acoustics of my room, and if, let's say, I were to move outdoors, it would sound entirely different. And so, like in that sense, I'm performing this environment, to you, and we were really interested in seeing how we could push that a little bit more. I mean, there are a lot of experiments going on now, I think, around the world about field recordings and transmitting them over Zoom. And over summer, some of our colleagues as well have staged these improvisational jam sessions that transcend time and space. So that was something that I was really excited about, a kind of technocultural ambience sharing.
Stephanie.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes, it is really excellent to be on this panel with all of you. And this is a topic that I've been thinking about for a while. Just looking at the interfacing of these different disciplines and how they're so interdependent on each other. And how did I get interested in this? And I think it starts with an earlier piece where I created a robotic garden where plants became the data points to show looking at global microfinance. And part of the reason for doing that was that data visualizations are usually representing issues relating to human material conditions, but they are so abstracted that they become really desensitized. So I was interested in creating a more sensorial experience by using plants as the data points. And from that, I just started looking into the history, which I talked about in the presentation, and there's always been such this interdependence between human social systems and biological systems. And the project that I was talking about at the end, which I didn't elaborate on that much, but Proof of Soil, was created around the same time that Paul Vanus, who is my colleague at University of Buffalo, was doing the labor project. And, it's just so fascinating to see that these, microscopic organisms, these microbes, are really interconnected into these giant information infrastructures and these larger economies. So maybe that sheds a little more light on the history of where this was coming from.
Yeah, thank you so much. As you see, like we all have a very diverse ideas about what boundary crossing means. We have a question from Michael for Joel. I don't know if Joel sees it, but I'm gonna read that. So you just referred to telematic music and technological ambience. Could you speak more to this? That description certainly caught my attention. This is Michael Palumbo, so you totally know him.
Yeah, and I want to say one of the experiments that I was mentioning is directed by him. And so Michael's one of our colleagues at York University who has been actively assembling these improvisational ensembles that would play over Zoom, and some of it has been audio visual as well. And I think about it in a couple of ways. I think about it through obviously the medium that we're immersed in right now, that it's a technological affordance that we're able to transcend time and space to connect with one another. And so there's definitely this physical sharing of ambience through sound. Like you can hear, like me sloshing around, like, if I were to spit, you could actually hear that terribly. But the idea is that there's a physical kind of connection, but then there's also the idea that the telematic embrace was never just about the affordances of technology to connect, like voice or to transmit sound, but it's also to create communities. And so I think the idea of a technocultural ambience tries to encapsulate these two concepts together in maybe one performance.
We have other questions, so I'm wondering if we should continue with the questions, or well, we will have time to also keep going, because I also have a question myself. But first, the audience. So biotechnology as a technology of love, wonderful. I'm wondering how scientists have reacted to your research, Jennifer.
I get a mixed bag. I describe my relationship with scientists as like dating, right? And so sometimes there's chemistry and sometimes there's not. And yes, so sometimes, yes, sometimes particularly maybe an older generation, although I should not say that is across the board, maybe rooted in a more modernist tradition of scientific practice, are not always open to my propositions or my propositional strategy, right? But I do find, first of all, there's a lot of scientists who have a very creative, maybe even like practice-based relationship with what they do, the way an artist might, who are very open to these discussions. And then I also tend to have a lot of younger scientists or students in the sciences will often really come and talk to me after a talk or something like that, because it is maybe more reflective of their experience or the type of language that they're open to using to describe their work. So I think we're experiencing a sea change right now in the sciences, where some of the language is not so tight, and some of the way that people describe their experiences. So for example, I was just rereading the work on Barbara McClintock, A Feeling for the Organism, right? And back then, like they would never have said in that book, the word love never comes up once to describe Barbara McClintock's relationship with maize. But I think if that were written now, I think that terminology would be more acceptable. So I think things are changing.
Yeah, definitely. I also find that our relationship with interdisciplinarity in general has become more open to like a cultural care in some way, and also I noticed that there's more willingness to have a dialogue. I noticed that with my own organization, the Arts High Salon, that like our community is growing, not because we are good or anything, but because there's really this need to connect to each other. There's this idea that you cannot actually solve the problems of the world by using only one discipline. You need to connect with other people, and you need to cross the boundaries. And I think one of the formula to do this is actually love. In this case, like would you compare love to empathy, or do you think it is a much stronger concept?
I think it's related to empathy, but I think it's and I think empathy is part of it, but I think love is there's a vulnerability. When you're empathetic towards someone, you're not always vulnerable towards them. You're aware of their vulnerabilities. I'm talking about really truly making yourself open to the other humans and the other organisms that we share this planet with. And I'm talking also about like maybe even an ecstatic sensation when that happens. Like, I just thinking about it now, I was thinking about climbing in the Rocky Mountains near where I grew up, and I could just feel the back of my spine light up. And so for me, love also implies some of those sort of maybe even synesthesia, physiological responses to being in the presence of others.
Can I ask a question in regards to that?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Well, I just keep thinking of the term biophilia, and you know, I guess in my knowledge, you know, it's more of an eroticization between humans and non-humans. And I guess my question would be, what do you see are similarities in using your kind of definition of where you see this relationship between love and the human and the non-human, and definitions of biophilia?
Sure. So I use biophilia in a lot of my writing, but I think that description of love for other organisms still had the human at the top of the food chain, right? So it was like a patronizing or a patriarchal or a dominating form of love. And I'm talking about maybe more immersive, horizontal relationship with the other organisms in the lab or in our ecology. So there's, again, more of a vulnerability or humility maybe in that position.
Can I go on with there's a fantastic question in the chat for Stephanie, which I love, because I actually thought about it when you were doing your project, and it's one of the things that really fascinates me about the project, because you're talking so much about like putting to work these bacteria. So what, how do the microbes get paid in all of this?
Well, okay, so let's say, how do they get paid? So let's refer to Paul Vanus's project and go back to biological market theory, and the microbes in his project, there's the exchange with human sweat. So that's one aspect of it. So you know, maybe we're thinking about different forms of value and currency, and in proof of soil, they're basically eating and transforming the toxic soil, right? The pollutants, the metals, and that's their form of payment. And then I also was thinking, Marguerite, that of the project Terra Zero and the augmented forest, right? Which directly looks at the blockchain and using the blockchain to create a self-governing forest, which is able to determine which trees, I guess, live and which trees are used for human purposes. Maybe that answers it.
I think it does. Maybe. Okay. So maybe I should just say something about the fact that yeah, as I mentioned before, we ended up actually creating something at the end. As Joel was mentioning, there's a lot of potentials in this like virtual embrace that we are finding ourselves in. Something that I still have to get used to. I must confess. But in 3 weeks, we're going to have a couple of events at, well, I should say the Fields Institute, but really not. We are going to do it from home. And one of them is Isabel Spa, the one that I was mentioning in my presentation. And this is like difficult because we are talking about intimacy and touch. And how do you create intimacy and touch when you are at home and you cannot actually touch each other and you cannot actually have any like human relationship? And we ended up doing like a distributed workshop with stuff that is sent to people, and people will interact with each other virtually with the real stuff in their hands. So I don't know if this is going to happen, but like this brings me to the second, like the further ideas that just are buzzing in my mind, and so we are talking so much about boundary crossing, and here we are in these like little boxes, and so what are, and this, I'm actually asking everybody here, even the people in the audience. So how do you actually break these boxes that we are in? Are you actually able to cross them physically, or have the sensation of crossing them physically? Or is there another way? What other solutions are there? And I know that there's a lot of solutions, but like, what did you find to be the best for doing this? This is open to everybody.
I think there's going to be a lot of work in this area. I think Zoom has become a very popular medium. And I'd like to acknowledge that Joelle did a piece just today where walking down the street carrying your laptop was a really excellent moment of like breaking those barriers. I'm working on a project right now where we're actually doing a library of the bioart transcendent use of Zoom and how the bioart community is using it. So Roberta, your workshop is on my list. And we're thinking about how do we activate audiences and their bodies and their like embodied response to bioart through Zoom technologies. The very best one I have seen so far is by Tina Tarpgard and the Recoil Performance Group out of Copenhagen. And she's a choreographer, and they did a piece with water and with algae where the Zoom camera kept switching different angles and eventually ended up in the performer's mouth and recording water in the divot in their neck. I just did one for the Bio Summit at on the weekend, where I'd put the camera in the ceiling of my lab and I curled up like in the fetal position and read my paper while lying on the lab bench in my lab. So I think there's ways that we can sort of like hack this technology, as we do as artists who work in art, science, and technology, to create more embodied, empathetic moments.
And now the questions are coming. Okay, so there's a follow-up question for Stephanie. But there's also something from Patrick that goes back to the touch. So I'm going to go back to his question, and then we're going to go back to the whole economics of bacteria and labor. So will touch have extreme cultural currency in the future? Now, this is a great question. Tonight I was out with one of my best friends having a beer, but at the end we gave each other a hug, and that seemed such a radical gesture when it would have been one of the most banal 8 months ago. Yeah. What about hugs? I've been giving a lot of virtual hugs recently, but really sometimes you really need to, like some people say that you should hug a tree. But I'm not sure. Anybody wants to say something about it?
I mean, yes. I was just talking with my partner last night. Like, can you imagine dating during this pandemic? How like exquisite and like foreign and terrifying a kiss from a stranger would be? Like this, I think the currency has gone right off the scale.
Yeah. And also, I don't know about you, but when I'm going down the street and I see people who are actually touching each other, it kind of gives me some gut feeling of some sort right now, because we are so used to keeping the distance. So we have really gone into this like distancing mode that somehow is... I mean, you feel safe because you're like, okay, so people have learned to keep the distances, but on the other hand, it's also somehow a little bit alarming to me, because are we gonna ever be able to go back and like really touch each other as like friends, like we used to do? All right. Okay. So, sorry.
Well, Roberta, I mean, I think one aspect of this, though, is that I think it makes us really appreciate much more what is now an extreme challenge, right? To have that physical intimacy on any level. And so it is so much more heightened when we do experience it. And actually, I remember in terms of thinking about these physical sensations and everything that's been going around about like hug a tree and how you kind of feel that way. And I remember early on, Kira O'Reilly, another amazing art science performance artist, and who's also a Buddhist, and she had posted a talk by a Buddhist couple, and they were talking about somebody who was on their deathbed and really had no mobility and was experiencing their last sensations of just feeling the air or the different smells that were in the room or different sounds, and that those became so critical to their just sort of being in the world. So I think that all of that is so much more heightened, and the value of it has really shifted.
Yeah, and if I may also mention, there was another, because this is also something that I'm really interested in, like crossing boundaries right now. What does it mean? And so I'm reminded of work by Pei Li, who just had, I think she got a prize at the Ars Electronica Festival. She is, so she had this work called the Tame. So basically it's a work where she is asking questions like, can we tame viruses? Can we befriend them? And can we coexist with them? And one of the exercises that she's conceiving is all these exercises. Well, she has this dancer was doing all these exercises to avoid surfaces and to touch things, but in a very elegant and appealing and sexy way. So I thought it was very it was an incredible performance. So going back to what we had before, let's go back to the economics, because we forgot there was one question about the relationship between Stephanie's work and economics, and how economists engage, if ever, engage with Stephanie's and Paul Vanuz's work. Because I think they should, but I don't know if they do. Have you had any experience with that?
I mean, I think it's a little bit like the situation of artists and scientists, that some scientists are responsive to more creative forms of talking about science. And I don't know Paul's experience. I don't think that he's been...
Sorry.
I don't think he's shown his work within the context of economists where they would be present. I have gone to 2 events. One of them is this conference that's called Intersections of Society and Finance. And so there were a few economists there, but most people were STS, Science Technology Studies. So we're a little more receptive to, it was really looking at the cultural dimensions of finance. But I showed these kind of early studies that I did that were whiteboard sketches of playing out biological market theory. So let's say you wanted to talk about trickle-down economics and you use parasitic plants. And then I had that very kind of cliche whiteboard thing going. And I just created these different vignettes dealing with biological ecosystems. And the people that were there at the conference who were focusing on economy or economists, they were just like, wow, that's interesting. I never thought about that before. So I didn't get too much of a challenge because, these kinds of comparisons can only really work in more simplified economic scenarios. And when they start to get really complex in more global finance, they tend to be more reductive.
That's very interesting. Maybe we should open it up to ourselves. I'm not conscious about the time because our moderator disappeared. So like, I don't know until when we can we can go. Like for me, we can just chat ad infinitum. So yeah, any other questions or comments from you? Oh, there's somebody curious about the inclusion musing of poetics, poiesis in all of the practices. Is this something that you consider to be a fertile ground to explore or entangle yourself within? Love the mention of Araway's in poiesis. Is this a question for everybody, or is this a question for in all the practices? Yeah.
I'm waiting for Joel. Joel?
Yeah. Oh.
Joel, I think Joel,
in a while.
Because this is his third panel, and then he has another one. So we should
I'm running the risk of just regurgitating everything that I've been saying over and over. It's interesting. I didn't mention Haraway's and poiesis, so I was like waiting for. Anyway, doesn't matter. So I think it's interesting because in working with the microbes, and I think what we're trying to do is to use a sound analogy, is to do a field recording as opposed to plagiarizing content. And what that means is like audifying as opposed to making visual, like audifying what's in the environment so you can hear it and understand it, as opposed to taking it and doing something with it and calling it your own, right? So a lot of our work, when I say our, I work closely with a collaborator, Mick LaRusso, and a lot of our work involves just kind of observing and being witnesses to the agency within the microbial environment. And so, like, very simple stuff, like we allow things to be in, albeit through, these kind of in vitro experiments, but we also go out in vivo in field experiments to try to locate where they actually live in the environment. And we consider this to be a kind of poetic gesture for a number of reasons. I think one is, this idea of poiesis, which is, sympoiesis is a good example. But I'm also thinking about, the relationship between allopoiesis and autopoiesis, where you think about the individuation of the microbe itself, but then the individuation of it in relation to its environment as well. So we want to try to capture this as witnesses. We want to try to understand this so that we can develop some form of empathy to that. So that would be what I'd say.
Who's next?
Well, I'll say, so I studied poetry writing with Fred Waugh for a period of time during my undergraduate degree. He's a very well-known Canadian poet. I think that storytelling and narrative is huge in my work, and even maybe non-linear, more atonal use of language is really important for me to try and create those schisms and transform myself and maybe also the audience or the reader into these alternate ways of perceiving things. So that's a key component of even my most academic writing. Always has these little turns of phrase or moments where the language jars you. I'm always trying to think about ways of breaking us out of our regular habits of working, of being.
Stephanie? Because I think that it was more directed to you, but that too.
I think it was for all of us.
But you mentioned Araway.
I did mention Araway. I just love that picture. I think everybody loves that picture.
It is beautiful.
It's so great. Yeah, I mean, I think similar to Jennifer is, you know, I don't like to be didactic in the work that I create. And so like when I'm looking at the question and the use of the word, you know, musing is just like a little bit more playful, and to use poetics and put these incongruous things together to, you know, kind of create like that shock of like, wait a minute, that doesn't go together. What does that really mean? And I think that's kind of more of what it is for me, is it creates these unexpected surprises.
Yeah, I think that's key. Like all of what you said is key also for me. I'm really interested in storytelling as well. I'm also interested in so I think that one of the things that art allowed me to, like, but I don't have a background in art. I just kind of became an artist after, and I'm still kind of like a third time artist. Doesn't exist a third time artist? Anyway, and so every once in a while I do some art. And one of the things that is very important to me is, how do I expose myself? How do I put myself out there and try new things that I could not be doing on like in my other work as an academic or as a writer. I can do it with art, and I can, and there's a lot of, and I can play with poetry and with different narratives, and I can play sci-fi and invent things. And in this particular moment, because we are so because you always have to reinvent yourself on a daily basis, because you don't know if plan B will be okay. So you have to think about plan B and C and D and E and whatever, because you don't know when the next lockdown will be. Then it's terrifying, but it's also very exciting, because you're really out there and you're putting yourself all in. And I think that this is very, like, his poetics and poiesis at the same time for me. Yeah. Somebody said yes. I don't know. Anybody else? Some final, maybe we should do some final comments about our project and what's next. What do we imagine for like the next little while? How do we cross boundaries? I know that you guys have all sorts of projects in your bucket, but like, what is realistic? What is not? What is imaginary? What are your wishes?
I'm really focused on, like, it's strange. Even before the pandemic, I was really starting to think really hyper local, right? And part of that is because I have small children and I'm really struggling with travel. But part of that is now that I've been living in Windsor for 10 years, I'm opening a new facility. It's a studio that is also a community engagement lab. And so I'm also trying to think about, like, how is that going to have tendrils out into my community? So the next couple of years, even before the pandemic, but now for sure, are going to be really working locally in Windsor with different collaborators, and also building connections within the region, the sort of Southern Ontario region, around using the space and how to use it as a way to engage with people and make it available to people. The other thing I'd like to say is that I'm still open for the road trip, and in fact, I'm dying for it. So I really hope that when things settle down, can we like rent a VW van and drive back and forth from each other's places?
I'm still looking forward to it. But also, I mean, so right now that I'm programming stuff online, I'm actually amazed at the amount of people who are actually like becoming more, like becoming closer and reaching out, and it's amazing the amount of people that I'm meeting. So for example, this workshop that I'm doing with Isabel, I'm gonna have people as far as from Mexico City, and I'm sending, like, today I went out to the post office and I sent to them my package, and it was like so sweet. I thought it was amazing. So these are little things that really make me really happy, and at the end these people will meet with other people that are local, so we're going to have 50-50, and this is like a great opportunity that probably we would have not had otherwise. So yeah.
Yeah, we're it's really interesting. We're getting all these invitations to go on our little camper van to different places now. That's great. I want to say, like, I think this situation is, at least from my point of view, is making us a little bit more open to the notion of experimenting with technological augmentations of the body. I think back on the kind of paranoia and like disgust in like maybe 10 years ago, like Adrian David Chuck had this little device called the Kissinger that you could actually, they had these little motors and sensors in this silicone wrapped lips that you could basically transmit a kiss live across a mobile phone network. And like it seems to me, as we were talking about intimacy online and stuff, that's the first thing that I gravitate towards, like the designing of these new, sensory experiments, essentially. So I mean, it's not like, okay, so that's not to answer your question. Like, what are you going to do next year? Oh, I'm going to develop some of this. No, that's not really what I'm
we actually don't know what we're gonna do, so
yeah,
like
we don't exactly. We don't really know what we're gonna do. So, by all means, it may be something that will allow you to whisper or blow into somebody else's ear.
Yeah, it's all wishes. I actually came to this. I mean, like, I was very happy to participate at ISEA this year because I thought, okay, so it would have been really great to see everybody in person, but I really want to be inspired by people. I really want to hear what other people think, because I am sure. So, like, I am not a big traveler. I usually travel during the summer, but I know that among us, there's a lot of like accomplished artists who have been traveling for like years and years, and now they are stuck at home. And I am sure they came out with all sorts of ideas about how to put their art out in the wild, yeah, so to speak. I actually really like, so like I'm following the chat, and I really like Amy calls, I think Jennifer's lab, tentacles and tendrils, which is amazing. That's exactly how I imagine it, tentacles. So you go local, but you can also go global as you want.
Yeah, I think the road trip we have to figure out how to cross the border, because there's definitely like geographically, we're actually all so incredibly close to each other, right? I mean, Roberta and Joel are in Toronto, and Jennifer in Windsor, and I'm in Buffalo, and Kathy High, who just commented, is in Troy, and Amy is in Columbus, right? So there's like, we're all so close, but who knows? We won't know November 3rd because it's going to go on until, but yeah. The Underground Railroad is in Buffalo. So some of us are looking into that and its current status, what kind of state it's in, right?
Yeah.
As a possibility.
I was actually thinking, well, this is something that we haven't really talked about, as in because like the macro scale of boundaries is like the physical border, right? And Jennifer is right at the border, and this is something that I kept going back to, because even before the pandemic, it was actually not particularly easy to cross the border, especially if you're a racialized person. Like, not like I'm a white guy, white woman, so like I can go wherever. But like still, it was quite annoying to cross the border, and it's such a pity because we are so close. I remember talking with Paul once and laughing about the fact that we are both quite lazy, that we never see each other because we never cross the border, because yeah, it's right there, but we feel so close and so far away at the same time. And this is a situation that is completely different from other places, like, for example, say Europe. In Europe, there's still some circulation. Here, recently, here in Canada, you cannot even go from province to province. So it's the problem of like the macro problem of borders is actually quite big at this moment. Ooh. Somebody just posted something really long.
I know, we're all reading it now.
I think are they kicking us out?
I think our time is up soon.
Okay. All right. So yeah, it is about time. Okay. So thank you so much for the inspiring panel, and thanks to the audience. Like, I really love their comments, and I will definitely check out the lovely links that I posted.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, everybody. And we'll see each other in the next panels because we are everywhere.
Joel's going to take a 5-minute nap in the crib behind you.
All right. Bye.